Hello everyone, welcome to this presentation from Ridley-Ellis and Marlene Cramer from Edinburgh and April University. We'll give you a short introduction to the construction industry in the UK and to see which timber elements we find in buildings, which timber elements we find in the current housing stock, and also how the recycling industry in the UK works. So when we are talking about the UK, we are always talking about 4 different regions, which are Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And Dan, you are from the UK, and you should know better than me. Why are we separating this in these 4 regions? Are they very different from each other?
Yes, they have different histories and different legal frameworks, different planning regulations, and also the populations are very different between the different countries, and the dynamics of the populations are different in different countries as well. So they have different construction and they have different housing needs too. The other thing to note as well is that often houses are not coming to the end of their life because of the materials. They're coming to the end of the life because the buildings aren't the right kind of buildings, or they're in the wrong place. And the population changes across the UK are actually quite influential on the housing needs too.
Since the housing stock is mainly located in England, we can look at the age distribution of houses in England. And on this slide, you can see that the pre-1919 buildings, so buildings that are around 100 years old, make about 20% of the building stock in England. But the largest percentage of houses that already exist are built between 1945 and 1980. And only 24% of houses are built past 1980.
So many of the buildings that are now coming to the end of their lives are of the traditional brick and block construction or concrete construction. And it was only really since the 1970s that we got more timber frame in construction. But there is still a lot of wood in these old buildings.
And if we look at new houses that are constructed at the moment, it was 214,000 houses in 2017. And which types of buildings are common in the UK?
So we have detached houses and semi-detached houses, quite a lot of apartments, especially in cities.
But compared to countries in the EU, the population living in apartments in the UK is quite small. Only 14.1% live in apartments. In Ireland and North Macedonia, it's even less. But for example, in Germany, more than 55% of people live in apartments.
Yes, and it's detached houses and semi-detached houses that are the traditional form of construction here. And bungalows, because of our ageing population, bungalows are the really sought after type of construction. Another way that buildings can go unsuitable for the population is if the population gets older. Often they want smaller houses or houses without stairs.
The majority of houses in the UK is still built in masonry, around 62%. But timber frame is taking a large proportion nowadays as well, with around 25% of new buildings. And the rest is made of steel frame or other methods of construction, which include concrete and also mass timber products like CLT.
So off-site construction is about 10% of the current total.
But still, the UK is not meeting its building target of 300,000 houses per year. So how could off-site construction maybe help?
It's something that the government and the industry would like to increase because it solves quite a few of the problems. The reasons that we've not met our building targets are often because of skill shortages and economic reasons, and it's possible that more off-site construction can solve those problems. So the common methods for off-site construction are timber frame, that's a little bit more than half, but there's also a lot of precast concrete and light steel frame and structural insulated panels too. Off-site timber frame has been very common in Scotland for many years. It's mostly about 80% open two-dimensional panels. There's a small amount of closed panel construction and even smaller amount of volumetric units.
And this is a bit of a difference to mainland Europe, where volumetric units are already used a bit more. Here it's more of a novel approach still. And of course, productivity is higher when you use volumetric units. So there's a potential to increase the productivity as well.
Yes, although one of the reasons that open 2D panels are popular is that you don't have to have such tight quality control on site. This is another training issue. If you have closed panels or volumetric units and things get damaged on site, then that's a real problem. But open 2D panels, things can be fixed a lot more easily.
Yeah, so we see great differences in the different countries of the UK in this sense in the timber frame construction. We see that in Scotland it is already a mainstream use. The timber frame construction makes 83% of new build in Scotland, but in all other countries there's a high potential to increase the timber in construction, especially in England, where we saw that most houses are built. Only 23% are currently timber construction. Also in Wales and Northern Ireland, the share of timber buildings could be increased a lot. And in commercial buildings, we actually see a high variance over different years. We see shares of 6 to 15%, but currently it's probably around 9% of commercial buildings are built in timber frame, which is also not a lot, but the potential here is also much lower than in domestic houses. So who decides on which material is used for these buildings? Do we need to convince every single house owner to use timber in their building, or who decides on the building materials?
But the key thing to understand about the United Kingdom housing market is that most of the buildings, most of the houses are built by developers. And the people who buy the houses, they don't have a lot of choice as to what's in the home or what it's made of. The biggest three construction companies, house builders in the UK, they build a quarter of new homes, and the top 10 companies build 1/3. So these big companies, they tend to build housing estates with many identical or nearly identical houses based on patterns. On these housing estates, it's usually then the builder that chooses the material and the type of construction that's used, and they'll do that on the basis of economic decisions. It won't matter at all to the people buying the houses. And there's usually not an architect in the usual sense for these buildings. Only about 6 to 8% of houses are self-built, but the number is expected to grow.
In European countries, in some countries, it's much bigger than in the UK. In Sweden, for example, it's 60%, and in Germany, nearly 60%, and even in Ireland, it's 55%. So you're telling me that the houses in the UK actually do look like in this first scene of Harry Potter, where we see the Privet Drive where the Dursleys live, and all the houses look exactly the same, with exactly the same tree in exactly the same spot?
That's a very realistic movie, actually. That is very typical of the houses that most people live in or even aspire to live in. But you live in the UK, do you not live in a house like this?
No, not really. I do live in a flat, and we learned earlier that only 29% of new houses are apartment buildings, and that detached and semi-detached houses are much more common. Also, I live by myself. Is that quite common in the UK?
This is a trend in the population as well, because families are much more complicated than they used to be in the past. So this is another reason why the needs of our houses are changing. So the kinds of houses that people want are changing. Because the kinds of lives that people are living are changing too.
But this is quite similar to European countries, to EU countries. This development that people tend to live more on their own. For example, in Sweden, 42.5% of households are one-person households. So when my parents were my age, they were starting to build their own house and to have children. But for me, that doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. How many people own their house in the UK?
We have quite high house ownership here. It's about 65%, although it's mainly the older people that own their houses. but it's lower than Spain, but higher than Germany. But we still have this mentality in the UK that people would aspire to own their houses. It's just that they increasingly can't afford to do so because house prices, because of the lack of supply, now 10 times the average yearly income. When we're thinking about design for reuse and design for remanufacture, we should also be thinking about flexibility in the design too, so that the buildings can adapt to changing needs. And some of the things that change are people's lives, what kind of buildings they can afford, the size of their families, and their different lifestyles as people get older too. One of the reasons that houses are hard to afford for young people is that we don't have that many houses of a size and price that is suitable for young people. We still have a lot of houses that are far too expensive for normal people to afford. They not only need to be thinking about the environmental side and the design for reuse and things like that, but price. Price is super important because if people can't afford to live in their houses, then they're no good. So compared to countries like the USA and Australia, our houses are pretty small, but they're very close to the European average of little under 100 square meters of floor area per house.
So we see that a house is more expensive than average, but it's a little smaller than average. How does this fit together?
Well, UK has quite a high population and one that's growing, and we have quite a dense population too. And land prices actually are the significant proportion of the cost of a house.
So that basically means that I still have a chance to buy a house in the UK if I just move to Musselburgh instead of Edinburgh.
Yeah, so actually this is what most people do. In order to be able to afford somewhere to live, they live out of the city, and there are usually areas around cities where lots of new houses are being constructed, so huge developments.
What would my typical house look like then? I mean, really look like from...
We've got really two kinds of house here, the timber frame house and the masonry house, the brick and block construction house. But they usually look very, very similar.
Oh, yeah. I couldn't really tell which of these are timber frame.
From the outside, the houses look very similar because there is usually a masonry or something that looks like masonry or concrete screed, cement screed on the outside of the house. So whatever it's made of, they tend to look very, very similar.
So what's the difference then between these two building types if it's not the looks?
Well, the cost of construction is actually quite similar between the two. But there is quite a big difference in the construction time, and time is money. The time between you building the house and someone paying to move in, the shorter that is, the more money that you make. In a timber frame house, the walls that you don't see, they're timber studs and often oriented strand board with plasterboard on the internal side for fire protection. In masonry construction, the walls are brick and block. The floors in a timber frame house tend to be, in the modern ones, cassettes. So they're manufactured as a unit and brought to site, and they contain I-joists and a lot of panel products, so oriented strand board or plywood or chipboard. This is where you would tend to find more timber though in a masonry house. The floor joists would tend to be solid wood in a masonry construction. The roofs of both kinds of construction would be very similar. They would tend to be a truss rafter made from wood with metal plates.
So this means no matter which construction method we use, we will find a lot of local Sitka spruce and Scots pine in these houses?
Well, no, because the UK is a huge importer of timber, has been for a very long time. There's a very small amount of homegrown material that actually goes into the construction market here, and when we're talking about the off-site timber frame construction, it's very, very small amount of the homegrown material. But we do have a big industry making particle boards, and they do use quite a lot of homegrown material. Yeah, so the timber in construction, there's quite a lot of sawn timber, um, some particle board, some MDF. Cross-laminated timber has very high profile, but in volume terms it's relatively small.
So if so much timber is imported, can't a little bit of this high demand that obviously exists be covered by secondary timber? Is it done at all in the UK?
Well, roughly a quarter of it is construction waste, a quarter of it is packaging waste, and a quarter of it is demolition waste. The remaining quarter, about half of it is industrial waste and about half of it is municipal waste.
Does it have any potential for structural use? What kind of timber, secondary timber, do we find? Where does it come from?
It is for the panel products, yes. It's quite a big market in the UK, and most of the wood is recycled in one way or another. At the moment it's 4.5 million tonnes annually. About 30% of it is categorised as clean wood, about 40% is treated. There's quite a high proportion of panel products in there, so chipboards, some MDF, which causes some problems with the recycling, some plywood and some oriented strand board in there as well. The best quality stuff, or the interesting stuff, tends to go to community wood recycling in the ideal situation. These are small businesses or social enterprises that are set up to make interesting things out of bits and pieces of wood that are recovered, and often that's linked in with training of skills for people or things for artists to do, but they also provide a place for people to go and buy quite cheaply wood to make things with. But most of it is chipped on site, chipped because that's the most convenient thing to transport. So it's turned into small flakes, and there will be a little bit of separation done there to separate out the metal parts and the stone parts from the wood. A relatively small amount is going to landfill, and about 7% is exported. What's it exported for, do you know?
It used to be exported mostly to Sweden and as biomass for incineration. The export market has been shrinking a lot in the last years because the UK is also focusing more on biomass for heat production and energy production. So, especially the export numbers have been declining in the recent years.
Yeah, so it's a little under half is going into biomass energy. Less than 1% is classed as hazardous waste and has to be incinerated in special facilities. Of the remaining 30% of that chip material, quite a lot is going into panel products, new panels, mostly into chipboard. A small amount as well is going into MDF construction. Some of it is going into mulch, composting for parks and gardens, and about 7% is going into animal bedding for agriculture. At the moment, nothing is really reused in the sense that we like to think of it in this project, apart from this very small amount that's going to the community wood recycling.
And why would you say is that? Are there any particular barriers to the reuse of timber, and is there any potential?
In the past, people would separate out this material because there was a market for the reclaim, for the architectural salvage, and they would save the good stuff. But these days there's no market for it because it's been taken by the large volume retailers who have very low price for new material. And also one of the problems is the health and safety aspect of demolishing buildings. It's not safe anymore, not considered safe to dismantle it in the way that they used to in the past, and it's done with machines who just tear everything down, and it's very difficult for them to separate out the good stuff from the bad stuff. There is also this really good market for the chip material, and most of the panel producers would like to have more material. So it does go into a good economic use right now. It's just not the high level use that we would like to see in this project.
Yeah, especially the cascading use can be enhanced a lot. In the recent years, the biomass sector has been growing a lot in the UK, and probably in 2020, more than 50% of used wood will be burned. And also, a lot of wood pallets are imported from the US, and some virgin material is used for bioenergy as well. So we see that there is potential to make more of the resources that we have to be less wasteful and enhance the circularity. Because even after the second or third use of the timber, of course, it could still be used for bioenergy.
This has been an overview of construction in the UK, how we build our houses, and what we're interested in this project. I think the key things to understand here are the way that the housing market works here and the drivers for construction are being slightly different than they are in other parts of Europe. And the fact that actually we have really good markets, existing markets for recycled and recovered wood here, and no problems with wood in large volumes going into landfill, which is what most people think is happening. And the other thing to bear in mind from this is when we think about design for flexibility, that actually it's not the materials coming to the end of their useful life, it's buildings coming to the end of their useful life that really matters, because they're in the wrong place, or they're the wrong kind of building, or they're going out of fashion. So when we're thinking about flexibility in design, it's really about the buildings being able to adapt to those new needs, rather than making the materials last much longer. So when a building is taken down, the wood in it is by and large still good quality. There's nothing wrong with it.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you everyone for your attention. I hope you took something from this quick overview of the UK construction industry and could compare it to your own country. There are probably some similarities, but also some differences, and that was our goal to give you an impression about the industry. Of course, it was a lot of information. Watch it all again and have a good time.
Like and subscribe.